What is gender, sexuality, and variations in both? How do we make sense of a world that can be characterized as heavily influenced by gender and sexuality? How does gender and sexuality contribute to social inequalities and discrimination? How do folks express themselves on a vast continuum of gender and sexual identities? On this episode, we're talking all about gender, sexuality, and sexual identities. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's get to it. My name is Dr. Derek Silva, and I'm an associate professor of criminology studying harm and injustice in the social world. On this episode of Social Problems, we are talking about gender and sexuality and the role that each play in society. In this episode, we're going to talk about the key differences between the concepts sex and gender, and how understanding these differences is incredibly important for our engagement with the social world. We'll talk about some of the historical foundations of gender roles in society and how the so-called masculine and feminine gender roles are defined and enacted in both policy and in practice. We'll also discuss gender inequality at both home and work and how they're in many ways built into the institutions that make up our social structure. Sex is a biological concept that differentiates female and male. It refers to a set of biological attributes that are typically categorized within the dichotomy of male and female. Importantly, there is a great deal of variation in the biological attributes that comprise sex and how those attributes are expressed. It is primarily associated with physical and physiological features that include chromosomes, gene expression, hormone levels and function, and reproductive or sexual anatomy. While we commonly think that there are only two dichotomous sexes, that is simply not an empirical reality. According to Anne Fausto Sterling, a professor of biology and gender studies at Brown University, data suggests that 1 in 60 live births may be considered intersex, that include variations of anatomic or biological characteristics that do not align with sex dichotomization. And these variations may not even be apparent until puberty or attempts to conceive. Leonard Sachs, by contrast, has estimated that the prevalence of intersex folks is about 0.018% of the world's population, while a 2018 review indicates that the number of births with ambiguous genitals is somewhere in the range of 0.02 to 0.05 of the world's population, upwards of 4 million people. So regardless of the figure you use, the evidence is clear. Not every person on this planet aligns perfectly with one of the two biological sexes. The existence of these folks is an empirical reality. This raises important questions when it comes to the consequences for these folks in a world that we've built almost exclusively along lines that distinguish two biological sexes. Gender is a social division referring to the social and psychosocial attributes by which humans are often characterized as quote-unquote male or quote-unquote female. Gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, as well as gender diverse folks. It influences how people perceive themselves and each other, how they act and interact, and the distribution of power and resources in society. Gender is usually conceptualized and enacted along the sex-related binary, for example, girl-woman and boy-man. Yet there is considerable diversity in how individuals and groups understand, experience, and express it. This is in addition to the considerable social shifts to understand gender as a much more expansive continuum that encompasses a number of different variations. This movement has been widely successful in shifting public discourse away from the dichotomization of gender to understand the varying expressions of gender identity that do exist. Indeed, gender encompasses the shared understandings of how all folks should look and act upon their corporeal identity, and defines how we should practice social interactions. For your first read, watch, respond, please answer the following questions. How does sex differ from gender? How are gender roles learned? How do gender roles lead to social inequality? There are, importantly, also a variety of interactions one may have with their gender identity. Cisgender, for instance, describes people whose biological body matches their personal gender identity. This experience is very different from one who is, by example, transgender, which is where one's biological sex does not align with their gender identity. As we have talked about, intersex folks are people born with so-called ambiguous sex, which might include any variation of genitalia, reproductive organs, or chromosomes. Our world is absolutely structured along both sex and gender lines. Think of the ways in which all of us from a very young age have been expected to behave, present ourselves, embody roles, and act in very specific ways based on our supposed sex and gender. Think of the ways in which some of these roles are even placed on us by others in our social environment. Perhaps no example of this is more clear than the proliferation of so-called gender reveal practices that have seemingly taken over social media. As parents, in their understandably enthusiastic way, present their children to the world through hitting golf balls or baseballs, or slicing open cakes to reveal a particular color, said to be connected to a particular identity. They simultaneously stake claims about the gender identity of that child even before they are born. While I'm not suggesting this is necessarily harmful, it is a moment for sociologists to think about how we reinforce and socialize young people into their gender identity. Sociologists call this gender socialization, which is a process by which people learn their gender-based behavior. This socialization process links gender to personal identity in the form of gender identity and to distinctive activities in the form of gender roles. Gender roles are defined as learned patterns of quote-unquote typical behavior that a society expects of people based on their perceived gender identity. These gender roles typically take on dichotomous characteristics and reinforce what are called masculinity and femininity. Masculinity, as a socially constructed idea of how boys and men should act, are qualities that people in our society expect to find in a typical or so-called typical man. Femininity, on the other hand, is a socially constructed ideas of how girls and women should act, or the various qualities that people expect to find in a so-called typical female. Deviations from either of these roles are often faced with some sort of social conflict with either other people or the social institutions that we engage with. This social conflict is often conceptualized by sociologists as gender inequality. Gender inequality can be defined as the differential success of people based on their gender identity in gaining access to valued rewards and the opportunity structures erected in society. This tends to stem from structural arrangements, interpersonal discrimination, and even cultural beliefs. The chapter you read this week also examines how gender inequality is constructed in the paid workforce. Attention is drawn to the division of work into gendered occupations, which is partially maintained through the existence of the glass ceiling in the workplace. As women tend to occupy less well-paying jobs, they are more likely to experience poverty, what is referred to as the feminization of poverty, where women are overrepresented among the impoverished people of the world. One of the most pressing and important examples of this structured inequality is what we call the gender pay gap, where there is an empirically observable and consistent difference in earnings and associated benefits between gender identities, most commonly based on the analysis of men and women. For example, according to Statistics Canada, in 2018, female employees earned on average between 12 and 15% less per hour than males. In 2016, Canada was ranked 8th in terms of highest gender pay gap out of the 43 countries examined by the OECD. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the massive rise of unemployment that resulted from lockdowns, the National Women's Law Center found that women accounted for all of the jobs lost in the US during December 2020. Interestingly, according to a survey conducted by Ipsos and King's College London, 20% of men believe that reports about the gender pay gap are quote-unquote fake news. And well, sorry folks, the only thing fake about that is whatever makes you think that an empirical reality is not true. But it's not just about the pay gap, which solely looks at differences in remuneration and benefits for labor based on gender identity. It is also about the opportunities and treatment in the workplace. Sociologists have articulated that there exists what is called a glass ceiling in the labor force. The glass ceiling refers to the empirically observed pattern of women receiving differential treatment in terms of the opportunity structure. While women can and do have considerable success, they have a much more difficult time reaching and entering the topmost positions because of the structural barriers to advancement that are enacted throughout society. Indeed, gender inequality can be latent in the form of the gender pay gap or the glass ceiling, but it can also be manifest in terms of the extremely problematic and even violent forms of discrimination that range from sexism or discrimination and derogatory attitudes and beliefs that promote stereotyping of people because of their gender, to physical and sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is any unwarranted physical or verbal conduct directed towards a person that is sexually suggestive, offensive, or humiliating. Sexual harassment, while often latent and indirect, can also take a manifest and explicit character in the form of quid pro quo sexual harassment. Quid pro quo sexual harassment is the blatant demand by employers for sexual favors in exchange for promotion, opportunities, salary increases, and preferential treatment. The course material also discusses how, with changes in contraceptive practices, women may choose to put off or control when they have children, thus allowing them to occupy lives and duties outside of the home. Nonetheless, when it comes to the division of household labor, women continue to be expected to contribute more than men. Again, this is an observable fact and has been documented by a number of sociologists. However, the ways in which the division of labor occurs is also impacted by several factors, including age at marriage, remarriages, and common law relationships. With respect to the caretaking of children, whether one's own children or through a daycare or nanny capacity, women continue to be primarily responsible for this role, thus further highlighting gender inequality, particularly when mothers are given more caretaking responsibility than fathers. 5 theoretical perspectives are used to explain gender inequality, its role, and its development in society. And these are outlined in the chapter Structural Functionalism, Conflict Theory, Feminist Theory, Symbolic Interactionism, and Social Constructionism. Recall that for structural functionalists, all elements of society are interrelated. Therefore, inequality rewards effectiveness and efficiency because inequality is what motivates folks to work within society. Gender inequality thus stems from what was at the time an effective household arrangement, which has in some ways failed to develop with the times, but is nonetheless quote-unquote functional in society. Structural functionalists have been rightly critiqued for actually reinforcing gender roles as a so-called function in society and thereby downplaying the real intangible consequences of gender inequality. Conflict theory, by contrast, suggests that gender inequality results from struggle for economic and social power, and that the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie benefit greatly from gender inequality. According to this perspective, the capitalist structure creates the conditions that fuel gender inequality by forcing non-dominant gender identities to maintain the workforce without pay or with relatively little pay. For conflict theorists, this at once explains the increased gender expectations regarding domestic work, as well as the trends within the workforce that lead to the glass ceiling, the gender pay gap, and the rise in service work expectations for certain gender identities. For symbolic interactionists, socialization and labeling throughout the life course shape gender identities. We are constantly engaging with the world in ways that construct, shape and reshape, consolidate, and challenge our gender identities. For interactionists, most, if not all, gender variations are cultural and learned through socialization. They hold that a gendered self develops out of a process of gradual socialization that operates at all levels of social life. Women, for example, learn how to do supposed women's jobs and enact women's roles, which reinforce how they see themselves as suited for certain tasks in the labor market. In this way, media, religion, language, and social life help maintain gender differences and work to normalize double standards that create different expectations based on gender identity. Feminists have, of course, been at the absolute forefront of uncovering and illuminating gender inequality throughout history. Feminists were at the front lines in the suffrage movement in the late 19th to early 20th century. For so-called first-wave feminists, the central goal of the women's movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the right for women to vote in elections. With women's suffrage or voting rights, other goals, social reform, legal rights, would then be more readily attainable. Feminists were and still are at the forefront of this fight, which sadly still exists today. Feminists hold that gender inequality is an almost universal characteristic of society. It is the result of patriarchal values and institutions that have been embedded throughout the social system, and that continue to structure society in such a way that favors men over women. Finally, for social constructivists, the creation of gender equality is a social process. It is created through the series of interactions amongst people, but also with institutions and the products they produce, like law and policy. This process requires some sort of leadership and organization. And because society has been historically structured along patriarchal ideals, men typically hold these leadership positions and are thus able to structure and organize society along those lines. This week, we also talk about sexualities and sexual orientation. Sexual identity can be defined as how a person self-identifies, whether that be straight, gay, lesbian, transgender, pansexual, questioning, or otherwise. It is about the ways in which folks experience and express themselves sexually. Understanding sexuality through sexual identity, we can look at the variation in expressions, roles, expectations, behaviors, and so on that folks take on in relation to their sexual preferences. This is called sexual orientation, or one's sexual attraction to people of a specific sex, sexes, or genders. Sexuality is approached as a continuum, or as a diverse set of relations, from homosexuality and heterosexuality to bisexuality, pansexuality, sexually questioning, asexuality, demisexuality, fluid, omnisexual, queer, and so on. The term queer is typically used to denote folks who do not identify as heterosexual. The bottom line here is that sexual identity is not inherent or natural. As a social system, we actively create what is considered quote-unquote normal, and thus simultaneously also what is to be considered deviant. Consider the example of the rise of the term homosexual. Western society constructs heterosexuality as the norm, but this wasn't always the case. As social philosopher Michel Foucault demonstrated, the invention of the word homosexual only emerged during the Victorian era in the late 1800s. The Queen at the time, Queen Victoria, wanted to stop male aristocrats from having sex with other men, something that was not openly talked about, but still practiced in reality. There was no word for men having sex with other men, and Queen Victoria charged her physicians with studying this phenomenon. Having established a word for this, homosexual, these medical doctors invented a counterposition, that of the heterosexual, to denote supposed non-deviant sexualities. Thus, it was the will of one person who established the latter as the natural and normative position from which human sexuality was henceforth categorized. The historical consequences of which can be identified by looking at how homosexuality was a medical pathology in the DSM until 1973. This history shows that by its very invention of the word, homosexuality was set up as the opposite, deviant sibling of heterosexuality. Sexual orientation can be labeled in a number of different ways, and part of the challenge in being able to quantify the different sexual orientation populations has to do with whether sexuality has become ingrained as an identity or can be viewed solely as sexual behaviors. In other words, there are a host of methodological questions that sociologists must consider in how they measure these diverse groups. Despite the fact that many may consider sexuality as a binary, it actually should be situated on a spectrum, and thus we, as sociologists, must account for this in our analyses. The social process of coming out for members of the LGBTQIA+ community is incredibly important, as it is an act that can impact individuals' social relationships and their positions in society. LGBTQI+, or LGBTQIA+, are acronyms used to speak about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer, intersex, and questioning communities. Coming out can perhaps be defined as one of the most important steps in the sexual career of an LGBTQIA+ person, which is the process of disclosing their sexual identity to others. It is a social process of declaring oneself to the world and often has social consequences for people. It may actually have life or death consequences. In this way, some have suggested that one's ability to come out safely is itself a privilege that must be analyzed as producing and reproducing some forms of intersectional oppression. The ability to come out may also be affected by the attitudes and laws regarding sexuality in society. And this week's material examines how these attitudes have varied over time and space, and how religion and societal norms regarding morality impact the laws pertaining to homosexuality. For your read, watch, respond, please answer the following questions. What makes the process of coming out so significant to sociologists? How do societal views and norms impact LGBTQIA+ communities? Societal views regarding sexuality change when the focus is on populations who experience some form of disability. These societal views often appear to be steeped in the misconceptions that these populations cannot and should not be sexually active. These problematic approaches to sexual diversity have had a number of consequences for groups that do not align with the trope of heterosexuality as the only form of socially accepted sexuality. Consider the case of the HIV/AIDS pandemic that continues today and still manifests in really problematic and harmful treatment of LGBTQIA+ communities. The chapter also looks at differences between polyamorous and polygamous relationships, and when and how these relationships are criminalized. So read that closely for our discussions about crime and violence in Chapter 6. These forms of heterosexism, defined as discrimination against homosexuals in favor of normalized heterosexuality, and homophobia, defined as fear or legit hatred of homosexuals or behavior that suggests such fear or hatred, continue to manifest in real and empirically observable ways, and they continue to really harm people throughout the world. The chapter also discusses homophobia and the factors that may contribute towards homophobic sentiment. Mass media play an important role in how the LGBTQIA+ community is perceived by society, and these media representations are often simplified overgeneralizations of an entire group, and we know this can have harmful effects. For structural functionalists, homosexuality and asexuality threaten quote-unquote traditional institutions like the family, which are, for them, established largely for procreation, which has often led to a number of problematic structural functionalist arguments within the field. Conversely, many structural functionalists view homosexual and LGBTQIA+ communities as providing social cohesion and promoting social acceptance in the same ways heterosexual communities do. A main corollary of the structural functionalist approach is that it is almost always in favor of the status quo, as proper quote-unquote functioning of the system is always continued functioning of a pre-existing functioning system. So if you follow this theory to its logical conclusion, it will always offer problematic approaches to the emergence of progressive, novel, or new modalities of social relations while favoring traditional and historical ones. This perspective has thus rightly been critiqued for propagating homophobic approaches to gender identities, sexuality, and non-traditional sexual relations. Conflict theorists hold that heteronormativity, or the normalization of heterosexuality throughout the social system, establishes heterosexuality as the hegemonic or the dominant and acceptable sexual relation, and homosexuality as the deviant or unacceptable one. The gender binary we have erected forces people to accept only one gender and thus one sexual orientation, and any deviation from that creates conflict with hegemonic power. For conflict theorists, this extends far beyond social relations and into the division of labor in advanced capitalism. Those who deviate from the supposed norm will face more economic and social inequality. Symbolic interactionists suggest that people's identities reflect the roles that they are permitted to play in any given social environment. For interactionists, Labeling based on gender identity and sexual identity can create stigma, which is damaging and leads to what Irving Goffman, probably the most famous symbolic interactionist, and a Canadian by the way, calls impression management, or one's own conscious or subconscious attempt to influence the perceptions of other people about themselves. For interactionists, this impression management may yield different forms of disclosure or non-disclosure as a self-protection mechanism. Feminist theories hold that people vary widely along a continuum of genders and sexualities, and corresponding gender identities and sexual identities. People express their sexualities differently across time and space, and across societies and cultures. Since we live in a patriarchal system, feminists hold that any deviation from social expectations of that system face challenges, conflict, and barriers to access social and economic resources. Finally, for social constructivists, both gender and sexuality are created through our social interactions. They're created by the social system which frames expectations, as well as our responses to those expectations. Without claims makers and moral entrepreneurs who seek to influence the cultural discourse about sexuality, few would even care about other people's sexuality. But these folks have been widely successful in influencing our cultural and political systems, including media and government, to create a moral panic about sexuality and sexual identity. While this indeed may be changing, society is still structured in such a way that favors heterosexism in both latent and manifest ways. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something about gender, sexuality, various sexual and gender identities, and the role that they all play in society. This has been Professor Silva, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Social Problems.